The day Theodora's father threw her suitcase into the rain, he told her she was dead to him. She had refused to marry the oil tycoon's son, refused to be a bargaining chip in her father's empire-building schemes. As the iron gates of the Whitmore estate closed behind her, she had $17, a biology degree, and nothing left to lose. 12 years later, those same gates would open for her again, but this time she wouldn't be crawling back. She had spent every waking hour in research labs, sleeping in her car, living on ramen and spite. Her breakthrough came at 29, a gene therapy that could halt the progression of a rare degenerative disease that was previously untreatable. The irony wasn't lost on her when she received the call from her brother, Cornelius. Their father, Ambrose Whitmore, had been diagnosed with that exact disease. The tremors had already begun, the weakness spreading through his once commanding body. He had maybe 18 months before he'd be completely paralyzed, unable to speak, unable to move, trapped in his own flesh. Every pharmaceutical company had turned him away. The treatment was still experimental, not yet approved, impossibly expensive. But Theodora's company, Lazarus Biome, held the exclusive patents. She was the only person on Earth who could save him, and they both knew it. She made Cornelius relay her terms precisely. She would provide the treatment, cover all medical costs, ensure her father received the best care available. But Ambrose would move into her home, live under her roof, follow her rules. Every injection, every meal, every doctor's appointment would happen on her schedule. With her approval, her father's lawyers tried to negotiate. They offered money, tens of millions. She had more. They offered public apologies. She didn't want them. They threatened legal action, suggesting she had a duty to provide care. Her lawyers, better than theirs, laughed them out of the room. For 3 weeks, Ambrose refused. The tremors worsened. His left hand became nearly useless, curling into a claw. His speech began to slur at the edges, words tumbling over themselves. His wife, Marguerite, the woman who had stood silently by 12 years ago, now begged Theodora for mercy. "He's your father," Marguerite had said over the phone, her voice thin and desperate. Theodora had replied, "He made it clear I had no father," and hung up. She didn't block the number. She wanted them to keep calling, to hear the desperation grow. On day 23, Cornelius called again. His voice was different, this time defeated, hollow. "He agrees to your terms." Theodora had been in her office, overlooking the Boston skyline, and she'd smiled at her reflection in the glass. Have him ready to move by Friday? The house she'd prepared wasn't her actual home. It was a property she'd purchased specifically for this elegant but modest townhouse in Cambridge. Comfortable but not lavish. She wanted him to understand immediately that his days of marble floors and servants were over. This was her world now, and it operated by her rules. Ambrose arrived in a private car, Cornelius helping him up the steps. He'd aged dramatically since she'd last seen him, not just from the disease, but from something deeper. The arrogance that had always wrapped around him like armor had cracked. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. Theodora opened the door herself. No staff, no intermediaries. She wanted him to see her face first, to understand that this mercy came from her hand alone. "Father," she said, the words strange and sharp in her mouth. "Welcome to my home." He tried to meet her eyes, but couldn't hold the gaze. His jaw worked, words struggling to form. "Theodora, thank you." The gratitude sounded like it was being dragged out of him with hooks. She stepped aside to let them in. The foyer was simple, clean, nothing like the Whitmore estate's ostentatious entrance with its crystal chandelier and dual staircases. "Cornelius, you can leave now," she said. Her brother looked between them, uncertain. "I said you can leave." After Cornelius left, Theodora showed Ambrose to his room. It was on the first floor. She wasn't cruel enough to make him manage stairs in his condition, and it was comfortable. A good bed, a private bathroom, a window overlooking a small garden. But it was small, maybe a quarter the size of his master suite at the estate. "Your treatment begins tomorrow," she said from the doorway. "Breakfast is at 7. I'll need you in the kitchen by then." She watched him absorb this, the reality that he would be expected to come to her, to follow her schedule, to exist in her orbit. "I can't." He started, holding up his trembling hand. She cut him off. "You can. You will. Or the treatment doesn't happen." She left him there, closing the door on whatever protest he'd been forming. That first night, Theodora couldn't sleep. She lay in her actual bedroom upstairs and listened to the house settle, knowing her father was below her, probably also awake, probably realizing for the first time what he'd agreed to. She'd imagined this moment for years, having him dependent, powerless, stripped of all authority. But now that it was here, she felt something she hadn't expected: emptiness. The next morning, Ambrose appeared in the kitchen at 7 sharp. He'd dressed himself, though his shirt was buttoned wrong, and he'd managed to shave, though he'd missed a spot. He stood in the doorway like a visitor, unsure where to sit. "Coffee?" Theodora asked, pouring herself a cup. He nodded. "Then get a mug." "Cabinet to the left." She watched him struggle with the cabinet door, his hand shaking, nearly dropping the mug. She didn't help. This was the point for him to understand helplessness. They sat across from each other at her small kitchen table. No dining room, no staff serving courses, just 2 people and breakfast. "The treatment protocol is aggressive," she said, sliding a folder across to him. "Injections every morning, oral medications 3 times daily, physical therapy in the afternoons. You'll be sick for the first few weeks as your body adjusts." Ambrose opened the folder with clumsy fingers, scanning the pages. "How long until I'm better?" His voice was thick, harder to understand than it had been even yesterday. The disease was moving fast now, as if it knew its window was closing. "You won't be better," Theodora said flatly. "The treatment halts progression, repairs some damage, but you won't return to normal. You'll plateau somewhere between where you are now and where you're headed." She sipped her coffee. Still better than the alternative. They fell into a routine over the following weeks. Every morning, Ambrose would appear in the kitchen, increasingly disheveled as the treatment made him nauseous and exhausted. Theodora would prepare his injection, and he would have to sit still while she administered it. She could see how much he hated this, the intimacy of it, the reversal of power, having to trust her with a needle in his arm. The physical therapy sessions were worse for him. A therapist named Octavia came 3 afternoons a week, and she was kind but firm, pushing Ambrose through exercises that left him sweating and frustrated. Theodora often worked from home those days, positioning herself where she could watch through the doorway. One afternoon, Ambrose fell during an exercise, his legs simply giving out. Octavia moved to help him, but Theodora appeared in the doorway. "Let him get up himself," she said. Octavia looked uncertain, but Theodora's expression stopped any argument. They both watched as Ambrose struggled to his knees, then to his feet, shaking and red-faced. "Why?" he asked her after Octavia left, his voice ragged. "Why do you need to humiliate me?" He was sitting in the living room, slumped in exhaustion, and for the first time he was looking at her directly, demanding an answer. Theodora sat across from him. "Do you remember what you said to me the day you threw me out?" He didn't answer. "You said I was nothing without the Whitmore name. That I'd come crawling back within a month, begging forgiveness." She leaned forward. "You said I'd amount to nothing, that I was too weak, too idealistic, too stupid to survive in the real world." "I was angry," Ambrose said, but the words were hollow. They both knew anger wasn't the whole truth. He'd believed what he'd said. He'd always believed she was lesser, that she existed to serve the family's interests. You didn't come to my graduation, Theodora continued. Medical school. I walked across that stage with the highest honors in my class, and you didn't come. Mother told me you said it was a waste of time, that I was playing at being important. Her voice remained level, controlled. So no, father, I'm not humiliating you. I'm educating you. Over the next month, Ambrose's condition stabilized and then began to improve. His tremors decreased, his speech cleared, his strength slowly returned. But the improvement seemed to deepen his misery rather than lighten it. Being helpless was one thing. Being helpless and knowing you were recovering only through your daughter's mercy was another. Theodora made him ask permission for everything. To use the car service she'd arranged, to have visitors, to make phone calls after 8 p.m. She wasn't capricious about it. She always said yes to reasonable requests, but the asking itself was the point. Every request was a reminder of his dependence. Cornelius visited weekly, and Theodora allowed them privacy, though the walls were thin, and she could hear their conversations. Her brother would try to console their father, suggest that soon he'd be well enough to go home. Ambrose would fall silent at these suggestions, and Theodora knew he was doing the math, realizing that even when he recovered, she controlled his medication, his follow-up treatments, his continued health. One evening, about 3 months into the treatment, Marguerite came to visit. Theodora answered the door to find her stepmother dressed immaculately, armor of pearls and designer clothes, but her eyes were red-rimmed. "I'd like to see my husband," she said, her voice cold. "Of course," Theodora replied, stepping aside. "He's in the study." She didn't offer tea, didn't make small talk. Marguerite had stood silent while Ambrose disowned her. She'd watched it happen and done nothing. Theodora gave them an hour, then knocked on the study door. "It's getting late," she said, opening it without waiting for a response. Marguerite was holding Ambrose's hand, both of them looking up at her with expressions she couldn't quite read. Resentment, certainly, but something else, too. Fear, maybe. After Marguerite left, Ambrose remained in the study. Theodora found him there past midnight, staring at nothing. "You should sleep," she said. "Tomorrow's a treatment day." He didn't move, didn't acknowledge her. She was about to leave when he spoke. "I failed you," he said, and his voice broke on the words. "Not just the day I disowned you. Before that, always." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were wet. "You were brilliant, even as a child. Creative and passionate and brave. And I tried to crush all of that because it didn't fit what I wanted you to be." Theodora stood very still. This was not what she'd expected, not what she'd prepared for. Anger she could handle. Resentment, resistance, pride, all of that she'd anticipated. But this raw admission shook something loose in her chest. Why? She asked and hated how young she sounded. Why wasn't I ever enough? It was the question she'd carried for 12 years, the one that had fueled her through every sleepless night, every impossible challenge. Ambrose struggled to stand, managed it on the second try. "Because you were too much like me," he said. "The parts I hated in myself. The ambition, the stubbornness, the refusal to accept limits." He moved toward her slowly. "I saw myself in you, and I wanted you to avoid my mistakes. But my mistake was thinking I could control you into being someone else." "You're only saying this because you need me," Theodora said, but her voice wavered. "Because you're dependent on me now, and you're trying to manipulate me into softening." She wanted it to be manipulation. That would be simpler. Maybe, Ambrose admitted. Maybe I wouldn't have had this clarity if I hadn't lost everything. But that doesn't make it untrue. He reached out, his still trembling hand hovering near her shoulder, not quite touching. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know what you've built, who you've become, I'm in awe of it. Theodora stepped back and his hand fell. You don't get to be proud of me now, she said, her voice sharp. You don't get to claim any part of what I've accomplished. I built this without you, in spite of you. But even as she said it, she felt the anger cracking, revealing something rawer underneath. The next morning, Theodora administered his injection in silence. But something had shifted between them, subtle and uncomfortable. Ambrose noticed it too. We don't have to talk about last night, he said as she cleaned the injection site. I understand if you need to hate me. I don't hate you, Theodora said, and realized it was true. Hate would be easier. Hate is clean, simple. What I feel is... She trailed off, unable to find the words. Hurt, betrayal, grief for what should have been, anger at what was. And underneath all of it, the stubborn, pathetic hope that maybe he really had changed. Weeks passed. Ambrose continued to improve. He could walk without assistance now, could button his own shirts, could speak clearly. The treatment was working better than Theodora had dared hope. She should have been triumphant, her father restored to health, still under her control, still dependent on her goodwill. But instead she felt the weight of her revenge growing heavier. One afternoon, she found him in the kitchen making tea, something he'd started doing on his own. He moved carefully, precisely, conscious of his regained abilities. I called my lawyers today, he said without looking at her. I'm changing my will. Theodora froze. This was it, the manipulation she'd been waiting for. Let me guess. You're cutting me out again unless I release you from our agreement. Her voice was ice. No, Ambrose said, turning to face her. I'm leaving everything to you. The business, the properties, all of it. Cornelius will receive a trust fund, but you'll control the rest. He poured his tea with steady hands. Not because you're holding me hostage, because you're the only one capable of running it properly. I don't want it, Theodora said immediately. I don't want anything from you. But even she could hear the lie in her voice, not because she wanted the money or the power, but because she wanted what it represented, his acknowledgement, his respect, his admission that she was everything he'd claimed she could never be. I know, Ambrose said. That's why you should have it. He sat at the table, gestured for her to join him. Cornelius is a good man, but he's weak. He'll destroy everything within 5 years. You won't. You'll tear it apart and rebuild it properly, make it something worth keeping. Theodora remained standing. This doesn't change anything. Our agreement stands. You live here under my rules, as long as you need treatment. She was clinging to the revenge, to the power dynamic, because letting it go felt like losing. I know, Ambrose said again, and I'll stay as long as you'll have me. Not because I have to, but because... He paused, struggling with words. Because I'm learning who my daughter actually is. And I don't want to miss any more of that. Something broke in Theodora's chest. She sat down heavily, suddenly exhausted. You don't get to do this, she said, and her voice was shaking. You don't get to become someone different now. I built my entire life around proving you wrong. What am I supposed to do with that if you're not wrong anymore? Ambrose reached across the table, his hand no longer trembling, and covered hers. You keep building, he said simply, but maybe not out of spite this time. Maybe just because you're extraordinary at it. His eyes met hers, and she saw something she'd never seen before, genuine pride, untainted by expectation or control. Theodora pulled her hand away, stood up, left the room. She made it to her bedroom before the tears came, angry, confused tears that she hadn't let herself cry in 12 years. She'd wanted him broken, dependent, remorseful. She'd gotten all of that, but she'd never anticipated that his breaking would break something in her too. The revenge had been supposed to be simple. Make him suffer as she'd suffered, make him understand what he'd done. But suffering had transformed him in ways she hadn't predicted, and his transformation was forcing her to confront uncomfortable truths. That holding on to anger was exhausting. That revenge, even successful revenge, didn't heal the wounds it was meant to address. Over dinner that evening takeout, Thai food eaten at the kitchen table, Ambrose told her about the company's current struggles. Real estate holdings underwater, bad investments and failing tech startups, executive turnover creating instability. "I've made mistakes," he admitted. "I kept making them because no one would challenge me. Everyone was too afraid or too loyal to tell me when I was wrong." "You should have listened to Mother," Theodora said. "She was smart. She saw the digital transformation coming years before you did." Marguerite had a degree in economics from Cambridge, had worked in finance before marrying Ambrose. He'd sidelined her into charity work and social duties. "I should have listened to a lot of people," Ambrose said. "Pride is expensive. I'm still paying the bill." He looked at her carefully. "Would you consider consulting for the company?" "Not as my daughter. As the CEO of Lazarus Biome. We need your perspective." "No," Theodora said immediately. "I won't be pulled back into that world." But even as she refused, part of her was curious. The Whitmore Group had been her father's legacy, but it could have been hers too, in another life. What would she do with it if she had the chance? That night, Theodora pulled out the Whitmore Group's financial records that Cornelius had been sending her, ostensibly to keep her informed as a future heir, but really to show her how badly things were going. She studied them until 3 in the morning, finding problems and inefficiencies everywhere. The company wasn't dying, but it was sick, and she could see exactly what needed to be done. The next morning, she threw a folder on the breakfast table in front of Ambrose. "You're divesting from commercial real estate entirely," she said without preamble. "It's a dying sector, and you're overexposed. That frees up capital for 3 strategic acquisitions I've identified." She'd outlined everything: which properties to sell, which companies to target, how to restructure the executive team. Ambrose opened the folder, scanning her notes. His expression shifted from surprise to something like wonder. "This is brilliant," he said quietly. "This could save the company." He looked up at her. "Will you help implement it?" "No," Theodora said, "but I'll consult. Monthly meetings, written reports, strategic guidance. I'm not coming back to that world full time." She poured herself coffee, aware of his eyes on her. "And this doesn't change our arrangement? You still live here? You still follow my rules?" "Understood," Ambrose said, but he was smiling slightly, and Theodora realized with discomfort that he looked happy. Not relieved or grateful, but actually happy. Proud of her. And that pride was worming its way past her defenses in ways that anger never could. The months that followed established a strange new rhythm. Ambrose lived in her house, dependent on her for his continued treatment, following her rules. But he'd also become something like a colleague, someone she strategized with about business, argued with about approach, respected despite herself. The power dynamic remained, but it had grown more complex. Cornelius struggled with the changes. He visited less frequently, clearly uncomfortable with his father's diminished role and his sister's ascendance. During one visit, he pulled Theodora aside. "You're enjoying this," he said accusingly. "Keeping him here like a prisoner, making him beg for everything." "I'm saving his life," Theodora replied evenly. "Would you prefer I let him die to spare his dignity?" But Cornelius's words bothered her because they weren't entirely wrong. She had enjoyed it in the beginning. The question was whether she still did. 6 months into the arrangement, Ambrose's health had stabilized completely. His tremors were gone, his speech perfect, his strength nearly normal. Medically, he no longer needed to live with her. He could manage his own medications, schedule his own follow-up appointments. The original justification for their arrangement had dissolved. Theodora realized this one evening when she came home to find Ambrose cooking dinner, he'd started doing this occasionally, claiming he needed something to occupy his time. The kitchen smelled like garlic and herbs, and he was moving confidently, comfortably, like this was his home. "You don't need to be here anymore," she said from the doorway. "Medically, I mean. You could go home." The words felt strange, almost like a question. Ambrose looked up from the stove. "I could," he agreed. "Do you want me to leave?" He asked it directly, no manipulation, just a genuine question. Theodora opened her mouth to say yes, that the revenge was complete, that she'd proven her point, but the word wouldn't come. "I don't know," she admitted finally. This was supposed to be temporary. "A lesson, but it's become..." She couldn't finish the sentence. "A habit," Ambrose offered. "A routine, a relationship." He turned off the stove, faced her fully. "Theodora, I don't want to leave. Not because I'm afraid of managing on my own, but because I'm learning things here I should have learned 30 years ago. How to be humble, how to listen, how to appreciate what I have instead of always grasping for more." "You're learning those things because you have no choice," Theodora said, but her voice lacked conviction. "The moment you have your independence back, you'll revert. They always do." "Then let me prove otherwise," Ambrose said. "Let me stay, not as your prisoner, but as your father. Actually your father this time, not the tyrant who tried to control you." He paused. "Or let me leave. But make the choice based on what you want, not on what you think you should want." Theodora left the kitchen without answering. She went up to her room and sat on the bed, trying to untangle what she felt. The revenge had worked better than she'd imagined. Her father had been humbled, transformed, forced to see her as she actually was. But somewhere along the way, the revenge had stopped being enough. She'd gotten everything she'd wanted, and it had left her feeling empty. The truth she'd been avoiding was simpler and more complicated than revenge. She'd missed having a father. Not the father Ambrose had been, but the father he was becoming. The one who asked about her research with genuine interest, who offered business insights without trying to control her, who looked at her with pride instead of disappointment. That night at dinner, Theodora made her decision. "You can stay," she said, "but the rules change. No more asking permission for basic things. No more power games. We're equals under this roof or you leave." She met his eyes. "And we're doing this because we choose to, not because anyone is forcing it." Ambrose nodded slowly. "Equals," he agreed. "That's more than fair." He hesitated, then added, "Thank you for everything." "The treatment, yes, but more than that. For not giving up on the possibility that I could change." "I didn't do this to help you change," Theodora said. "I did it for revenge." But even as she said it, she wondered if that was entirely true. Maybe part of her had wanted him to see what he'd thrown away. Maybe part of her had needed him to become someone worth forgiving. They settled into a new routine after that, one that felt less like punishment and more like actual cohabitation. Ambrose helped with the house, Theodora consulted on the company, and slowly, tentatively, they built something that resembled a relationship. It wasn't perfect. Old wounds don't heal cleanly, and there were days when Theodora looked at him and felt the old anger surge up. But there were also moments, increasingly frequent ones, when she'd catch him reading about her latest research breakthrough, or when he'd share an article he thought she'd find interesting, or when he'd simply sit quietly in her study while she worked, asking for nothing, just wanting to be near her. In those moments, she'd remember that revenge, however satisfying, was ultimately about the past. And maybe it was time to start thinking about the future. 1 year after Ambrose moved in, Theodora and her father sat together in the garden she'd been cultivating. The experimental treatment had been approved by the FDA. Lazarus Biomedicine stock had tripled, and the Whitmore Group had completed its restructuring. Success all around. "I never thanked you properly," Ambrose said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Not just for the treatment, for giving me the chance to know you. The real you, not the daughter I tried to force you to be." Theodora considered this. "You earned it," she said finally. "Not through suffering, but through change." "That's what?" "I needed to see that you were capable of actually becoming someone different." She looked at him. "Are you happy? Here, I mean. Living like this. More than I've been in decades," Ambrose admitted. "Turns out power and control are poor substitutes for genuine connection." He smiled ruefully. "Expensive lesson, but I suppose I needed it." He paused. "Are you happy, I mean?" Theodora thought about it. The revenge had been satisfying, but it hadn't brought happiness. What had brought something close to happiness was the slow, difficult work of building something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. "Getting there," she said. "I think we both are." They sat in silence as the sun set, father and daughter, no longer bound by punishment or obligation, but by something harder to name. Not forgiveness, exactly forgiveness felt too simple for what had passed between them. But maybe something better, understanding, acceptance, and the fragile beginning of genuine love. The revenge was complete, but more importantly, it was over. And what remained was the harder, more important work of figuring out what came next.